And with that, he is smart, funny, kind, inspiring, determined, gracious, and wise. Ron Gibbs was born in Philadelphia, received his MD from the University of Pennsylvania. He was chair of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Colorado for over 20 years and is now a clinical professor at Stanford. Ron and his wife have been collectors for 35 years. He has lectured about cartography across the country, and his most recent publication is The Rogue's Plot. And before that, he published, I think it's down there too, The Long Shot. And with that, I give you Ron Gibbs.
Good. Good morning. Thank you all for coming here live or through Zoom. The alternative title for my presentation is The 8 Years of the American Revolution in 25 Minutes. So nowadays, Tom, as soon as we're ready, next slide. Nowadays, many people in the United States get their news from cable news network with such venerable reporters as Wolf Blitzer. If CNN were around 250 years ago, next, it might be called Colonial News Network with an earlier version of Wolf Blitzer. And if you're wondering why I chose Wolf Blitzer, well, I was just so impressed by how distinguished he looked. Next slide. So let's now turn the clock back 250 years and go to the 18th century Situation Room. And here we go for ye breaking news. 13 British colonies in North America declared independence from England, but the colonists, variously called rebels or patriots, have little chance, Wolf Blitzer's sources say. The American Revolution, we're not quite ready yet. The American Revolution was both a political and a military struggle, and forward-thinking colonists in North America were raising new ideas. They argued for the right of representative democracy. They argued for fair basis for taxation. They argued against the divine right of kings and against the extensive powers of Parliament. But for these political ideas to gain hold, there first had to be a military victory. And on the military scene, Britain had the upper hand. They had a professional army, the world's best navy, veteran generals, and deep resources. On the other hand, the colonists had no professional soldiers, experience only as a militia, an inexperienced commander-in-chief, few other experienced officers, and no central resources. Next slide. I promised you 10 maps, and the first one of these is of the British dominions. This is the Laurie and Whittle map, published in 1794, 10 years after the American Revolution, but I use it because of its handsomeness and its accuracy. So let's set the stage for the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War was fought from Canada down to Georgia, a distance of 1,300 miles. North America in the late 18th century was mostly wilderness with few roads and only 4 cities over a population of 10,000. And North America was very different from Europe at the time. It had hot, muggy summers, which was the military campaign season, and new diseases to deal with, such as malaria. Transportation was by foot and by horsepower. Armies would only move 10 or 15 miles a day, and the distance from New York to London was 3,600 miles, and that would take 4 to 6 weeks. Most of the war was fought along the Atlantic coast or within a few miles of the coast, and geography dictated the tactics. Next slide. We now go to Boston and environs from Marshall's Atlas. This is Chief Justice John Marshall himself becoming a historian, and he wrote The Life of Washington. This is the atlas published 1832. I use these maps because of their scope and their accuracy. We turn on the dots, Tom. So dot number 1 is Boston in the late 18th century, situated on a peninsula. It was the hotbed of political thinking early in the war. After 10 years of political struggle, the American Revolutionary War broke out at Lexington and Concord. If we go up to dot number 2, Tom, Lexington and Concord is just to the west of dot number 2. The British retreated from Lexington and Concord, being pursued by the colonists, and went to Boston proper, and a growing army of American militia surrounded them. Let's go to dot number 3. 2 months later, at the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Americans were dislodged by the British from their fortifications, but at huge cost to the British in men and officers, and this taught the British a lesson for the rest of the war. Stalemate then ensued over the next few months, and if we go to dot number 4, George Washington, now commander-in-chief, took advantage of a British oversight, and he fortified these heights called Dorchester Heights. And from there, if you just scan out a bit, Tom, you can see how American artillery would threaten the British in the town of Boston. The British had to evacuate, and they sailed off on March 17th, 1776, for far-off Nova Scotia. Next slide. We're going to take a quick look at the Northern Campaign of 1775, first half of 1776, again from Marshall's Atlas. So this map, let's scan out just a bit. This map is of eastern New York on the left side, New Hampshire on the right, and Canada on the top. In September 1775, a small band of American soldiers began a heroic expedition to Canada, hoping to make Canada the 14th state. They started at dot number 1, which is today on the Maine coast, and then they proceeded north and trekked 300 miles through dot number 2 to dot number 3, coming out before the citadel of Quebec City. In a blinding snowstorm, the Americans attacked the citadel of Quebec, but were repulsed at great cost. Their leader was severely wounded. 2 years later, that leader would again achieve heroism, but then he became the most infamous traitor in American history. His name, Benedict Arnold. The Americans then had to retreat up the St. Lawrence and back down the Hudson River Valley, their campaign to capture Canada, a total failure. Next slide. We now turn to the campaign of 1776 and William Faden's map from London in 1776. William Faden himself, the cartographer to the king and a producer of many great maps. Next slide. So this map spans in the center bottom from lower New York Bay and going all the way north up the Hudson to north of Manhattan. After retreating and refitting in Nova Scotia, the British commander, General Howe, had to resume the war to quash the American rebellion. His target would be New York City, the centerpiece of America. At dot number 1, his huge army of over 30,000 landed in western Long Island at a place today still called Gravesend. At dot number 2, a few days later, he handily defeated George Washington's forces at the Battle of Brooklyn and came within a few hours of wrapping up the entire American Revolution, but he delayed. And that delay allowed the American army to escape to dot number 3, Manhattan. 2 weeks later, the British did invade Manhattan and again had an opportunity to trap about half the American army in lower Manhattan, but Howe again delayed and allowed the American forces to consolidate. If we go up to dot number 4, in late October, Washington abandoned Manhattan and made a stand above dot number 4 in White Plains, New York. This was a draw, but the Americans had to relinquish the battlefield. Meanwhile, at dot number 5, in Upper Manhattan, George Washington made a fateful decision, and he left an unsupported post named in his honor, Fort Washington in Upper Manhattan. British General Howe returned from White Plains and inflicted on the Americans their greatest defeat of the war in the North in mid-November. The fort that was thought to hold out for months surrendered after a battle of just 4 hours, and 5,000 Americans surrendered, along with tons of irreplaceable materiel. Washington was pursued westward across New Jersey and made it across the Delaware River to Pennsylvania and temporary safety. Washington was in a glum mood. He said, "I fear the game is pretty well up." Next slide. We now turn to very important actions in the last days of December 1776 and the first few days of January 1777, the William Faden map. Next slide. You see coursing down the middle the Delaware River. To the left is Pennsylvania, and to the right is New Jersey. Let's go to dot number 1. With his options very narrow, George Washington decided to put it all on the line. His forces were now down to 2,500 souls, and what did he decide to do? He was going to attack. At dot number 1, he famously crossed the Delaware. He crossed from Pennsylvania into New Jersey to attack an isolated post at dot number 2. Dot number 2 was Trenton, New Jersey, and here were 1,400 Hessians. These were German mercenaries hired by the British. This became a lopsided victory for Washington. Nearly all of the Hessians were either killed or captured. At dot number 3, 10 days later, in the college town of Princeton, New Jersey, George Washington followed up with another victory, and these 2 small but important victories saved the cause of the American Revolution. Washington's exhausted troops then moved north to a winter encampment in the New Jersey hills. Next slide. We now move to the south and look at Charleston, the largest city in the American South, a population of about 10,000. Next slide, Tom. So this is dot number 1 shows the city of Charleston, the target of the British. And while the war was raging up north, the British sent a seaborne expedition to capture Charleston, but the Carolina militia was ready. And they built two forts at dot number 2, Fort Moultrie, and dot number 3, Fort Johnston, guarding the harbor. These were forts made quickly of sand and soft logs. Under American cannon fire, the British fleet, dot number 4, sailed into the harbor. But many of the British warships ran aground and became easy target for the American artillery. The vaunted British Royal Navy had to retreat back to New York, its tail between its legs. And this victory saved the American South for the Americans for another 4 years until the British returned. Next. Now we turn to Philadelphia and the map of William Faden, and this copy by Matthew Lotter in 1777. If we look at the dot number 1, this is the Delaware River on which Philadelphia is situated. Dot number 2, Tom, shows Philadelphia, well planned by William Penn in the 1680s, a grid which still exists today. Let's look down at the bottom for dot number 3. This was the an elevation of the Pennsylvania State House. Here in July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and henceforth this became known as Independence Hall. And I cannot pass off this map without pointing out dot number 4. This was my boyhood home. Let's go now to the next map. So this is a map, again, showing the coast of the Delaware River and the campaign of the British to capture Philadelphia. For still unexplained reasons, the British took a cautious seaborne route from the end of July until the end of August out to sea along the New Jersey coast, down the Delmarva Peninsula, and back up to Chesapeake Bay. At dot number 1, in late August, they landed at the head of Chesapeake Bay at a place still called Head of Elk, Maryland. When they landed there, they were 65 miles from Philadelphia at dot number 2. They were only 35 miles closer than they were a month before when they left New York. At dot number 3, George Washington formed his army in a defensive position at Chadds Ford along the Delaware River to try to stop the British capture of his capital. On September 11, 1777, there was a battle. It was a total victory for the British. The Americans were outmaneuvered, and only a heroic rearguard action prevented total disaster. Let's go to dot number 2. 2 weeks later, the British marched into the American capital of Philadelphia without firing a shot. Let's go to dot number 4. I think we can see that right up at the top, Tom. But George Washington was not done, and he decided he was going to attack a major British outpost just north of Philadelphia called Germantown at dot number 4. His attack began very well in early October, but because of fog and an overly complex battle plan, things unraveled. The British regrouped and chased Washington's forces away. More maneuvering occurred over the next couple of weeks, and at dot number 5, in mid-December, George Washington brought his forces into a winter encampment on the banks of the Schuylkill River and on the banks of Valley Creek at the hallowed winter of Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The next spring, following actions that I'm going to describe in a minute, the British consolidated their forces and gave up Philadelphia. Next slide. Now we're going to go to the momentous campaign in the North in 1777, and we'll return to the map from Marshall's Atlas. Again, we see these dots. While the main British army was on its way to Philadelphia under General Howe, another British army under General John Burgoyne, himself actually a playwright as well, was authorized by the British Secretary of State for the Colonies in London to attack from Canada. The two armies could not support each other, and this situation led to British undoing and the turning point of the American Revolution. In retrospect, the British were hampered by distance, by time, by disorganization, and in fact, ignorance of the conditions in North America. Let's go to dot number 1. Burgoyne's army jumped off from Three Rivers and moved up the Sorrel River to Lake Champlain. He had an army of 7,500, including British, Hessians, and Native Americans. At dot number 2, they made unimpeded progress and in early July captured the American fort of Fort Ticonderoga. They were very uplifted. But at dot number 3, the Americans were gathering a few miles north of Albany to meet the British invaders. Burgoyne was outnumbered and he was stopped in his tracks there. And after 2 battles, one in mid-September and one in early October, he was trapped and he surrendered in mid-October. This was the first major British disaster of the war. This led to the French alliance. The French were age-old enemies of the British, and the French were seeking revenge over their loss of Canada in the 1760s. So again, we have breaking news. With no possibility of escape, British General Burgoyne surrenders an army of 7,000 at Saratoga Springs to the American army under General Gates, and French King Louis XVI takes note and began discussions for the alliance, and this basically ended hostilities in the North. Let us now turn to the campaign again in the South and the late 1779. For strategic reasons, the British now turned south. They wanted to take advantage of the large number of loyalists. So the British Army, after victory and capture of Savannah, Georgia, this time captured Charleston, South Carolina. There was more maneuvering over the next year, with both the British and the American armies maneuvering like cautious boxers. The British would hold the field after many of the battles, but they could not replace their losses, and the American army remained intact. The American commander was George Washington's favorite, Nathaniel Greene, a Rhode Islander himself, and he famously said, "We fight, we get beat, we rise, and we fight again." Next slide. We now turn to late 1781 and Yorktown, Virginia. Next map. So we can see here, dot number 1 is the sleepy portside town of Yorktown, and in September 1781, the British marched into Yorktown to rest and to refit with supplies from the British Royal Navy. But at dot number 2, a surprise happened, and the French fleet came up from the Caribbean, got into the bay before the British, and beat keep back the British fleet. There was no hope of relief for the British in Yorktown. Meanwhile, George Washington marched his army from New York. He was joined by very strong French allies, and they began a siege of the British at dot number 1. Dot number 3 is the French initial siege lines, and dot number 4, the American siege lines. The siege was very effective, and with no hope of help coming, and with devastating bombardment from the French and the American artillery, the British surrendered in October 1781. The second disaster, the second British army to be captured. The British government and the British people had no more stomach for blood and treasure, and negotiations ensued in Paris. Next slide. This map was originally made in 1756 by an American physician named Dr. Mitchell. This is a French version by the noted cartographer LaRouge. In 1934, it was called the most important map in American history. Let's take a look at it. This handsome map has exquisite detail, so exquisite that it was used at the Treaty of Paris signing to define the borders of the new United States. Next slide. So the breaking news was the peace treaty was signed in Paris, and the reporters say, as we predicted in 1776, England's 13 North American colonies win their independence and the American Revolutionary War ends. So why was it, next slide, that the British lost and the Americans won? What about those criteria that we had at the beginning? Well, the British had the wrong strategy and they had the wrong generals. Britain had burdensome logistics. Every piece of equipment had to come across the Atlantic. The British were hindered by time and distance, and this interfered with their command structure. The Americans fought with the cause, and they had the right leader in George Washington. The Americans eventually had the right strategy, and the Franco-American alliance was critical. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why we get to celebrate July 4th and American independence, coming up on our 250th anniversary. Now, if you'd like to read a little more, next slide, this is a new novel set during the American Revolution that I just published 3 months ago called The Rogue's Plot. And the next one, published 4 years ago, actually the prequel to that, called The Long Shot. They are historical fictions. I brought along some copies. They're available on Amazon, and I will donate all of the proceeds from the sales to the education fund for the California Map Society, which will go to support the Rumsey Map Center. So at this point, I think I will close and say that I want to thank, last slide, I want to thank those who helped me get this presentation together: Kat Chanover, Craig Moll, Jackie Lasky, and Tom Paper. And at this point, open it for questions. Oh, town crier's bell.
We've got time for a couple questions. Have any? Yeah, Kat.
How did Louis XVI find out about? What did he find out that So the news got to Europe after a matter of weeks. The French would have had informers all through London, and the king and his ministers found out probably by November. And then negotiations ensued. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris. Other Americans had been in Paris as representatives of the new government. Any other? Right. Well, one of the atlases in our collection was called the Military Pocket Atlas, and this has about 6 maps in it. It folded in. It was sometimes called the Saddle Atlas because it could fit into an officer's saddlebags. But these were relatively large scale, and might scan the middle colonies at once, or even a larger area. There were maps of cities. There were large-scale maps which were accurate, but maps of the countryside and battlefields itself were just not available. The battlefield maps were published after the battle. The Trenton, the Trenton and Princeton map, that was published in England just about 5 months after the battle. So there was great interest in the English public about what was going on, but in terms of planning, they only had mainly large-scale maps.
Thank you. Thank you. Ron, thank you so much.